Okay, it's working now. Hello, everybody. It's been a while, but I'm here again. And I've been pretty busy, which is why I haven't really uploaded anything for a while. So I'm here again, though, and I want to show you something. So I've been browsing YouTube and getting into some pretty fun conversations online, and one I really want to highlight because, conversations online, you know how that goes, I'm sure, if you're watching any sort of video like this. But one I really want to highlight is this one right here. This video called "Was Jesus a Myth?" This will be fun. So let me restart it. And I'm just going to play it, and I'll see. I will see what I can do to remedy this issue. Whether or not was Jesus a myth, we will see.
Hello, my name is Scott Savage. I am the Alabama State Director for American Aid.
His name is Scott Savage, but as I've seen in his conversations that I've had with him, I think his middle name is Wannabe.
Theist. And I would like to talk to you today about the historical history of Christianity. Now, that title might sound redundant, but it has an important distinction.
So, the Alabama State Director for Atheists is going to tell us about the historical history of Christianity. Okay, we'll see where this goes.
How could anyone forget the stories of Jesus Christ? The feeding of the 5,000 with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish? Or Jesus at the Sea of Galilee, where a great multitude followed him because they saw his signs which he performed? Or the raising of Lazarus from the dead, where many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary had seen what Jesus did and believed in him? Or Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, which took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. Anyone ever noticed this cult before? We'll get to him in a minute. The Gospel of Luke states, "And it came to pass on a certain day, as he was teaching, that there were Pharisees and doctors of the law sitting by, which were come out of every town of Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem, and the power of the Lord was present to heal them."
Okay.
The Gospel of Mark states, "And he said unto them, Go ye into all the world, and preach the gospel to every creature." And the Gospel of Matthew states, "And the fame hereof went abroad into all that land." Thus we have the beginning of the spreading of the good news of Jesus Christ, starting at the year 1 AD.
Wait a second. No. Started at the year 30 AD when he began his ministry, as Luke says that it was approximately about the time of when Jesus was 30 that he started his ministry. Not to sound redundant or anything, but, sometimes you have to repeat these things over and over again because sometimes people don't get it.
And right there at the beginning were 3 wise men who spent weeks following a star in the east to worship the newly arrived Messiah. The Gospel of Matthew quotes them as saying, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him." Which brings us to our first problem. When did the spreading of this good news actually start? Was it really 1 AD?
No.
Or should we move that date back to 4 BC? Because according to the writer of Matthew, Jesus was alive before King Herod died in 4 BC.
Right.
The Gospel of Matthew states, "An angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod..."
I want to say first of all that recently, I'm not sure about in ancient history, but recently there's been a little bit of discussion as to when exactly Herod died. First of all, of course, Josephus says that he died in 4 BC, but some people seem to think that maybe Josephus got his dates wrong and he really died in 1 BC. Personally, I don't really think that that's the case because I haven't found any ancient historian who has disputed Josephus' claim that he died in 4 BC. So we'll get more on that later.
Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. Or should we move that date ahead to 6 AD? Because according to the writer of Luke, Jesus was born after Cyrenius became governor in 6 AD. The Gospel of Luke states, "There went a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed, and this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, everyone into his own city, and Joseph also went up from Galilee to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child."
Yeah, this is one of those issues with Luke that some people take into consideration. You know, was Luke referring to the time when Quirinius was the governor of Syria in 6 AD? Well, there are some hypotheses for that. Let me see, what was his name? Darrell Bach actually concludes his synopsis on all of these hypotheses by writing this right here. None of these proposals is guaranteed to be correct. Uncertainty about the succession of governors in Syria prevents us from making anything more than suggestions. The best possibilities are A, that Varus, during the time of Herod the Great, began the census, but the full effects were not felt until the governorship of Quirinius, and B, that Quirinius served as a high-ranking official or administrator of the census prior to his governorship, and C, that prote is best translated as before. So that's Bach's explanation. Another good explanation is that we don't really know who was the governor between 4 and 1 BC. So there have been some scholars who claim that was Quirinius, because it seems there have been a couple ancient archaeological finds that seem to suggest that someone was the governor of Syria twice, and some scholars think that might have been Quirinius. And, the hypotheses abound. Either way, this apparent issue that Scott Wannabe Savage is bringing up has many solutions, but, history is rife with uncertainty. So even this could be called into question, and even all of these hypotheses could be called into question. However, as I noted before, Josephus hasn't been disputed from a historical standpoint until, 2,000 years after he lived. Same with Luke. Luke wasn't really ever disputed by his contemporaries and other historians from the time, which, leads you to wonder why. Could it be that Luke, was actually pretty accurate on his dates? Who knows? We'll continue.
Alive in 4 BC, yet born in 6 AD, how can that be? Both of these stories cannot be true at the same time. Perhaps the historians of the day can tell us which of the two biblical authors was mistaken.
Probably
After
neither
all,
of them.
how could anyone miss a star that stayed in one place in the sky for...
That's another issue. The Star of Bethlehem. Very interestingly, Herod and his wise men never really saw the star. Because, when the three wise men, they came to Herod, they asked him, "Hey, we've seen the star of the one born king of the Jews." And Herod was like, "What? I haven't seen anything like this," essentially. And why is that? Well, maybe the best explanation is something that I found here. Yes. Where this talks about the star in the east. That's a problem, actually. So the star in the east was seen by the wise men in the east. So the wise men came, they said, "We've seen the star in the east." Why didn't they go east? Instead, they came from the east to the west. So they saw the star in the east and traveled west. That doesn't make any sense. And then it says later in Matthew that the star went down to Bethlehem. So then they go south. And then the star went before them and rested above the house of Joseph. I don't know what kind of stars they were seeing, but stars don't typically do that. So, one thing that this apologetic, or I don't know, I can't really tell if it's a Christian author, but he explains it like this. Actually, I'll just read this part. Astronomer Michael Molnar points out that "in the East" is literally translated from the Greek phrase "en te Anatole," which was a technical term used in Greek mathematical astrology 2,000 years ago. It described very specifically a planet that would rise above the eastern horizon just before the sun would appear. Then, just moments after the planet rises, it disappears in the bright glare of the sun in the morning sky. Except for a brief moment, no one can see this star in the east. So, it's actually said that this occurrence would indicate a future king. So these wise men, being astrologers from the east, it's also been argued about who exactly those wise men were. Were they astrologers? Were they pagans? Were they just Torah scholars? Can't really tell at this point. But if they were astrologers, then they would have seen this occurrence, which only if you had a very high education in astrological mathematics would you be able to see this and to notice it. So they left their place. They went to the west, and the star rests above Joseph, the house of Joseph. Another thing is that sometimes in ancient metaphoricism, the star could actually mean angel, and star was a metaphor for angel. So it's possible that the word star could mean either one. But regardless, what's indicated in the story is that Herod and his wise men didn't see it. That's pretty interesting. And if they didn't see it, why would anyone else see it? If these astrologers were from the east, they would probably come from a province that was not Roman, which means they probably had different ways of doing things. Possibly. So, that's just a couple of those things about this star, It probably was not a star that was literally just sitting there in the sky for weeks. That was really bright. Another thing was, I saw this Jerusalem Post article talking about Jupiter, Saturn, and another planet that sort of aligned in a way that made it seem like there was just a really bright star there, which they thought that maybe that was a Bethlehem star. Maybe. Who knows? I think this explanation, though, as the astrological mathematicians would have seen it, is probably the best explanation for this. So, there you have it.
For weeks. Here's a list of the prominent historians, philosophers, poets, and scientists that would have been contemporary to Jesus' life.
That's actually false. They were not contemporary with Jesus' life. For instance, Perseus was born a year after he died. And then how could you be contemporary with Jesus' life if you were, well, not even 10 years old when Jesus died? Really, that's just sort of him, this Scott Wannabe savage, just trying to mislead you and say that these people should have written about Jesus, but they didn't. So what the heck is up with that? We'll get into that more after he finishes his point here.
They wrote on politics and religion and even recorded every single geological event of the time. Yet,
they recorded every single geological event of the time. That's also false. Actually, a couple of these guys are mythical characters. What was this one? I don't have my glasses on for your guys' sake, so it's kind of difficult for me to tell. Oh yeah, Apollonius of Tyana. He was a mythical character, like on par with King Arthur. What? Why is he in here? And then we have, let's see, what was it? The other guy. I forgot. I'll get more into that later.
Every single one failed to mention the star that announced Jesus' arrival, or the earthquake that accompanied his death, or even Jesus himself. It's almost as if Jesus of Nazareth never existed at all.
Right, okay. So, a lot of these guys were not born or alive around the time Jesus was born. Jesus started his ministry when he was 30, so most of these people would have had to have been, let's see, if Jesus was born at 4 BC, then at around 26 AD, and a lot of these people were born after 26 AD. And then a lot of these people were born after 33 AD, which is when we suppose Jesus died. And then, a lot of these people weren't even 10 years old when Jesus started his ministry, so how could they have even thought to write about Jesus? Some of these people, let's see, this guy right here, Titus Livius, he died in 17 AD, so he wouldn't have been around when Jesus started his ministry. Let's see, maybe this guy, a lot of these guys. Maybe not this guy. And so it just is very interesting that he's actually bringing these points up, because none of these guys would have been, or a great portion of these guys wouldn't even have been around when Jesus was doing his ministry. And then let's talk about some of the other ones that would have been around. I actually have a nice little, no, not that one, darn it, this one. Yes, I'll bring that up. Let's see. So, Philo, he lived in Alexandria. Marcus Cluvius Rufus, we don't know where he lived. Quintus Curtius Rufus was around Alexandria, but it's uncertain exactly where. Lucius Julius Moderatus Columella, born in Gades, and moved to Syria in 35 AD, a few years after Jesus died. Florus Lucius, born in Africa, lived in Rome and Tarraco, spoke only of Rome and had an abridged military account of him, of Rome. So, why would we find anything about Jesus in his writings? Geminus possibly lived in Rhodes. We don't know for certain when he was alive. Gaius Julius Phaedrus, possibly born in Pydna, spoke of things that never really happened. He was a satirist. Pomponius Mela, possibly born in southern Spain. Valerius Maximus served a man in Ephesus at the time, the proconsul of Asia. Well, he was serving the proconsul of Asia. Lucius Annaeus, so Valerius Maximus, maybe. Lucius Annaeus Seneca, born in Cordoba, raised in Rome. Hero of Alexandria, active in, of course, Alexandria, and Rome and Egypt. And Apollonius of Tyana. So, again, this is very interesting, and I don't know why he's bringing this guy up in the first place, because he was mostly, for all intents and purposes, a fictional character. He had, I think, the emperor's wife, I think, wanted this guy, what was his name? Philostratus, to write about Apollonius of Tyana, and because she wanted to deify him. And then this was done in 230 AD, which is way after Jesus was around. I mean, come on, we're just saying. And so why is he even here? And why is he listed as a contemporary of Jesus? I don't know. Then Musonius Rufus, he lived in Rome. Pliny the Elder lived in Italy and also in Rome and Misenum and other places. So these people were not contemporaries of Jesus. Here's a little map, just in case, it couldn't get more clear. Here's where all these people lived. All of these people. None of them lived here, where Jesus lived. So why would they have written about Jesus? Someone who was very big, and he was a big deal in Judaism. But the Jews and the Romans didn't really like each other all that much. So why would he have been a big deal in Rome? Especially since he wasn't even, he wasn't starting riots. He wasn't starting or inciting violence against Rome. So why would they have even mentioned him? Why would they have taken note of him at all until, afterwards, when Christianity started to spread around in the Roman provinces? And of course the Romans thought that if you weren't a pagan and doing sacrifices to the pagan gods, then the pagan gods would get mad at you and at Rome and kind of smash it in a way. So that's when they would have gotten mad at Christianity, when it was spreading and Christians refused to offer sacrifices. And that's when it would have been noteworthy of Rome. Not when it was Jesus around a Jewish rabbi 2,000 years ago talking about how the Jewish religious leaders needed to get back to Torah. And whenever someone talked about Rome and trying to start or trap Jesus into inciting violence against Rome, Jesus would say, "No, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's." So there was no reason for Roman historians or satirists to even write about him. Continuing.
But there are historians that mention Jesus. Josephus mentions him as early as...
Oh, look at that. When Christianity was spreading, historians started writing about Christians. Go figure.
70. And Pliny the Younger does so in 112. And Tacitus in 115. But it's curious that these historians are constantly being trotted out by Christian apologists as historians were contemporary to Jesus Christ.
I'd like to see where he quoted that, because I don't really see any apologists saying that they were contemporary with Jesus Christ.
Which means they were only repeating what Christians were telling them.
Obviously.
Let's take a look at their writings and see what they had to say. Josephus said people called him the Christ. Pliny the Younger said they affirmed. Tacitus said those whom. Well, there is one thing that history confirms. There were, in fact, Christians living as early as 70 AD. But this is kind of puzzling. Were there no Christians living at the time of Christ for the contemporary historians to write about? To solve this puzzle, let's look at the historical documents of Christianity. Jesus first shows up in history sometime around the year 49 AD in Paul's letter to the churches of Galatia.
This is actually false, and I'll tell you why later.
Paul's letter begins, Paul, an apostle, not of men, neither by men, but by Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised... big intro to the letter. But when he gets to the meat of the subject, he says, I marvel that you are so soon removed from him that call you into the grace of Christ, unto another gospel. So there it is. The first time that Jesus Christ shows up in history is in a letter from Paul, chastising people for not worshiping Jesus Christ. Moving along, we see that the Gospels were written shortly after Paul began writing.
Those are false dates, actually. So it says that Mark was written in 64 to 75, Matthew 70 to 85, Luke 70 to 90, John 85 to 100. So he gives these dates, which are actually obviously leaning one direction on the scale of scholarship. Here's another list of dates. And these are also list some of the historians that are proponents of these dates. For instance, Mark. The earliest date that Mark has been suggested to have been written is 45 AD by John Wenham and John A.T. Robinson. And then the latest is AD 60 by A. Hernack. And then the most likely dates between 48 and 55. Then what about Luke? AD 57 to 62. 57 to 62. Still most likely 57 to 62. Acts, how about Matthew? The earliest proposed date is AD 40 by John Wenham and John A.T. Robinson, same people. And then the latest AD 110 by Paul Minier. And then the most likely between 65 and 70. And then John, the earliest AD 60, and then the latest AD 90. So the most likely is probably AD 90. So AD is what I'm saying, not AT. So it's really interesting. He brings up these dates, which in one case, in Mark, 64 isn't even the latest here. Where is it? Mark, the latest here is 60. So I don't know where he gets his dates from. It'd be nice if he actually cited sources. But what he says here is that Galatians is being in 49 is the first time that Jesus was mentioned is just not true. In fact, actually, there's a wide range of dates that scholars admit where all of the New Testament books were written. So he's just throwing out dates like, hey, these are the dates, but that's just intellectually dishonest, really. So to say that Galatians was the earliest, he would have to go over here and contend with Matthew, which might have been AD 40. So let's continue.
Writing of Jesus. Let's take another look at how the historians fit into the picture. As we can see, historians didn't start writing about Christianity until after Paul started converting people to Christianity. So what happened to the multitudes we've heard so much about? Well, the first time the multitudes show up in history is when Paul writes his stories about them.
He's trying to say that the multitudes were all made up, basically.
Did the history of Christianity really start around 180? Or did it start around the year 49? If it started around 49, then there's something on this chart that's not necessary for Christianity to start.
So, another issue here is he's saying that Paul's letter to the Galatians was the first book written, which is very interesting. And then in my conversation with him, he would say that Paul made up all of the accounts in Galatians, like the fact that he was crucifying Christians and persecuting them. Because, nothing says, hey, convert to my religion that I just invented, more than, hey, I was killing you guys, now convert to this new religion in which I was killing just moments ago. Plus, 49 AD compared to Jesus, who was supposed to have died in 33 AD. That's only, 16 years after the fact. Okay, so a little bit of background on Judaism. First of all, it is required by law that everyone who adheres to Judaism goes to Jerusalem and worships at the temple 3 times a year. And 2 of those times, it's mandatory that it is 7 days to 8 days total, consecutive. So then in the Gospels, it's written that Jesus was actually performing all these miracles, and not only that, but most of his wonders and works were performed, or many of his wonders and works were performed within the region of Judea, and on feast days, these 3 feast days in particular. And so let's get a grasp of the people that Paul would have had to convince that Jesus existed if Jesus didn't exist. People that would have been exactly where Jesus was 3 times a year. All of the 3 years that Jesus was doing his ministry, they would have been there to not see the multitudes that followed him, the uncountable multitudes that are written about in the Gospels. They would have been there to not see those, and then they also would have been there to not see all the miracles that Jesus was allegedly performing, and etc. Plus, these people were pretty astute at testing prophets. They thought that a few sects rose up, and I think Bar Kokhba, or what was his name? Judas Bar Kokhba, or Matthias Bar Kokhba. They thought that he was the Messiah, but that didn't work out very well. And then there was another guy, I forgot who. But the point is, even when Paul was writing to them, it says, I think in Acts, that they tested everything that Paul said. And that was, normal. Because in the Bible, in the Torah, in the books that these guys would have been reading, it says that if a prophet does these things or doesn't adhere to certain principles, you have to kill him. Oh, they also would have been there to not see all the riots that Jesus was starting and his apostles were starting, his followers. So, let's get the full picture. Paul had to convince people who would have been there when Jesus was doing all these things, who would have saw him, who would have been there to not see him, who would have been there to not witness all these wondrous acts, who were able to talk to the people that Paul was referring to, who were very adept at thinking critically on these issues. And there was a religious mandate, actually, to think critically on these issues. And they lived pretty close to where all of these things were happening. Plus, they lived in the time where education was valued. They had the Library of Alexandria. They had all these other places, like the schools in Rome, for instance. And they had their own schools. Jewish schools, they started at 5, going to Jewish schools. And even to be a member in some rabbis, to be a member of some rabbis' discipleship programs, you had to have the entire Torah memorized by the time you entered in, which was 5. So, these people were very intelligent. And these people are the ones that Scott, Wannabe Savage, is trying to tell us. We're the ones who were convinced to not only believe in this mythical character named Jesus, and all the wondrous acts that he performed, but not only to do that, but to die for him, to leave their families, to leave their the religious sects of Judaism, to be persecuted by the Jews and to be persecuted by the Greeks, because no one would have respected them. It wasn't a place of religious tolerance there. These are the people that Paul had to convince. Plus, there's a very big flaw in this argument. First of all, he says that the people were smart enough to have, and critical thinking enough to have written about Jesus, but on the other hand, they were stupid enough to fall for what Paul is telling them. Which is it, really? Okay, let's finish this.
Could this be the true history of Christianity? Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that no serious scholar thinks that Jesus is a
For good reason.
myth. You're thinking, well, the prophecies. Jesus fulfilled the prophecies.
Never crossed my mind.
What about the 500 that witnessed his resurrection? What about the Jewish historians that wrote about Jesus? What about the empty tomb?
Again, all things that historians, affirm.
Well, as with any other hypothesis, we should try very hard to falsify the idea that Jesus was a myth. We should also allow the idea to be peer-reviewed. And we should throw that idea out if anyone can falsify it. And we'll be doing just that in part 2 of the series.
Yeah, so this guy, he's not a historian, so neither am I, which means I am his peers that is reviewing his work, and it falls short, very short. It takes centuries to deify someone who did exist. Much longer to deify someone who didn't exist. And it's just sad. Here's our encounter with each other. I actually quoted Christopher Hitchens. When I said, basically Christopher Hitchens wouldn't even go as far to say Jesus didn't need to exist in order for Christianity to spring forth. In fact, he said these stories had to be based on some historical figure. Though he wouldn't, of course, go as far to say that Jesus did exist, the way that it is described in the Gospels. So, yeah, this guy, we threw some punches, can't really answer my questions. He doesn't even seem to know how to read with the way he answers me. So, I don't know, guys. You decide, really. It's a free country, and if you want to deny the idea that E equals MC squared, then you're free to do that. It just says something about your intelligence level. And if you want to deny the fact that Jesus existed, you're free to do that. Just know, again, like this guy said, no serious historian or scholar affirms that sort of denial. So, yeah, I hope you guys take this into consideration and consider this part 2 of his series, because he said he's going to be trying to falsify it, his hypothesis. And also notice that he's saying that this is a hypothesis, which means it can't claim the typical atheist mantra that I haven't seen the evidence. Well, since he is putting forth a hypothesis, he has to put forth evidence for that hypothesis, and he hasn't really. He's just baffled. No, sorry, he is baffled, I should say. Okay. Good night. I'm tired. Look at my hair. It signifies how tired I am.